Welcome back, everybody. So we are on to chapter 22 on inflation. So this chapter is going to cover inflation, its measurement, its effects, and how different economies experience inflation. I'm going to do a little bit different setup here with my presentation today. Hopefully that works out for you a little bit better. All right, so in this chapter, we're going to cover these topics, right? We're going to start with the introduction. We're going to talk about how to track and measure inflation using all these different various methods. We'll explore how inflation manifests in the United States and in other countries, including historical and global perspectives. We'll look at common misconceptions and confusions surrounding inflation, and we'll examine the concept of indexing and its limitations in mitigating the effects of inflation. All right, this video is only going to cover the introduction. So let's start with the basics. What is inflation and why should we care about it? Inflation is a sustained general rise in the level of prices across an entire economy. It's not a one-time price adjustment, but it's an ongoing upward trend in prices. Inflation's different from a relative price change, which could refer to the fluctuations in prices of specific goods. For example, if tuition increases but laptop prices fall, that's a relative price change, not inflation. Inflation occurs when prices in most markets increase simultaneously and continuously. It's an important measure so that we can analyze true economic growth separate from its price effects. So unlike shifts in supply and demand, which lead to new price equilibria, inflation represents continuous pressure on prices across many sectors of our economy. If inflation were a temporary phenomenon, then a single year of rising prices would not be considered inflation. Economists track inflation to measure price changes over time, which allows them to then analyze the true economic growth separate from the effects of those price increases. Having inflation there as a separate measure from GDP allows us to take that inflation out of the growth in GDP so that we get a better, more accurate picture of our real economic growth. So to understand and to measure inflation, measuring inflation is kind of an important topic here. We do a combination of different things that we do, but what we do is we combine the prices of many different goods and services into an overall inflation measure. We call this a basket. So we can use this measure to adjust for our economic indicators, like I just mentioned, GDP, to then show, instead of nominal GDP growth, we can show real growth, right? We take the inflation out. We can get rid of the inflation-driven increases in GDP. We can take that out and we can show real GDP growth. So this chapter is going to use some examples from the United States, but we're also going to look at inflation around the world to show how inflation rates differ across time periods and across regions. Inflation also really affects different groups in the economy: consumers, wage earners, lenders, borrowers, taxpayers. When inflation increases, people's purchasing power changes. And rising inflation can also influence our borrowing, our lending, and our wage negotiations. You're going to find that some people win during inflationary periods and some people lose during inflationary periods. One extreme case of inflation is what we call hyperinflation, which is an extremely high, rapidly accelerating rate of inflation. I mean, extremely high. For example, Germany, from 1921 to 1928, Zimbabwe from 2008 to 2009, both experienced some severe hyperinflation. In 2008, Zimbabwe's monthly inflation rate hit 79.6 billion%. In a hyperinflationary environment, prices can double daily, meaning that people's cash loses value literally by the minute. There are cases in Germany during this time frame where people People were not accepting paychecks at the end of the week or the end of the biweekly pay period. They were asking for their pay on an hourly basis from their employers. It was all piece rate, and they wanted to get paid then and there because the value was changing so fast. During the peak of Zimbabwe's hyperinflation, a loaf of bread cost 550 million Zimbabwean dollars. Can you imagine $550 million in Zimbabwean? The government tried to pay its bills, but it did so by printing excessive amounts of currency. It just let the money printers roll on through. But that then only led to further price increases. So the Zimbabwean government also enacted some price controls, right? So like price ceilings. But that led to shortages and it led to black markets. People started dealing underneath the traditional market. So ultimately, what happened in 2009 is they had to abandon their currency entirely and they started allowing foreign currency to circulate instead. So their government was unable to manage its own currency. They are reliant on the currency of other countries. So hyperinflation is a pretty clear example of what happens during severe economic disruptions and how that can occur when inflation starts to get out of control. And it really does have serious effects on the well-being of that nation when you are dealing with hyperinflation. This slide here shows 100 billion Zimbabwean dollar bill. Like that's a single dollar bill. Read all those zeros. 100 billion Zimbabwean dollar bill that was issued in 2008. And at the time, they were printing bills with face values of $100 trillion. And they ended up being nearly worthless. All right. Not shortly after, this currency was no longer supported by the government. At one point, 621 million Zimbabwean dollars were the equivalent to $1 US. That's the exchange rate. So, like I said, they just had to abandon their currency because it got too out of control for them to handle. So in the next video, we're going to cover how we track inflation over time, but that's a quick introduction to the topic, and I will see you all in the next one.